I often think that when something in the church is at its best, you can't pigeonhole it as conservative or progressive because the church is beyond those categories. I mean, we certainly are traditional in a certain sense because we're connected to tradition, so it has some of that element, but it's that tradition showing up now in this moment, and so it has that quality to it too. So I think the best things in the church are always beyond. And I wouldn't say, neither conservative nor progressive, but beyond those categories in some way.
Right. What's the line? The kingdom of God is like the what is it? The storekeeper. He goes into his storehouse and brings out the old and the new.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Everyone to another episode of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Sockold, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Father Nick Schneider. Welcome, Father Nick.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Brett.
So I have been encouraged more than once to reach out to Father Nick. And, when I heard it the second or third time, I said, okay, I got to do this. In my work, Making Every Class Catholic, I run into, with some regularity, people who are doing something with Montessori style education in the younger grades of the schools I'm working with. And I have some passing familiarity with Montessori, with Maria Montessori and with her method, but I don't know a lot. And Father, you've done a lot of work on this. And so I think this will be of interest to a lot of my audience. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up connected with Maria Montessori and her work and her method and even your day job, actually, which is not the most common day job for a priest.
It's all true. Yeah. So I'm a priest of the Diocese of Bismarck. I was ordained in 2009 on the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. And I have the doctorate in sacred liturgy from Sant'Anselmo in Rome, Italy. And I was assigned as a pastor to a parish in Mandan, North Dakota. It's kind of like a sister city or a bedroom community in a certain sense for Bismarck. Although I have to say it's grown to be quite a bit more than that, over time. Mandan, that is, great community here. And the parish that I was at had a parochial school that had been around since 1959, and it had kind of come on hard times. The enrollment was dwindling, and I was in this spot of losing sleep and hair and meals and all kinds of things, thinking that I was going to have to be the priest to close a school, which is never a fun place to be in. And I complained to my spiritual director, who said, "Father, if Jesus needs you to close the school, then you get to be the one to do it. And he's going to, grace you with what you need to do it if he doesn't want the school anymore." But my director said, "But maybe Jesus has another plan for that school. So why don't you ask him and offer a novena of masses with the intention of knowing what to do for the school, if he wants to close it or if he's got another vision." And I finished the 9th Mass in the novena. And that evening, I had a long-term friend of mine over to have a glass of wine, and I thought we were going to talk, Newman and Augustine and theology, and instead we wound up talking for 3 hours about Montessori education. And so he recommended that I get in touch with a woman named Joanne Schulzenberg, who worked at a school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Way of the Shepherd, a Catholic Montessori school, and helped to bring the elementary classroom to that school. And so we spoke for a couple of hours, and she encouraged me to go and do an observation at that school. So I went and I spent an entire day observing the children at that school at work, and was so taken with the dignity that the children had, the high level of work that they had, the immediacy of responding to their needs that the adults had because of the freedom that was there, that I left in tears. And I thought, even if our school wasn't failing. I was struck to my conscience thinking this is what children really need. So fortunately, we were able to start the following year, and we started with 2 3 to 6-year-old classrooms. Sometimes it's called primary, or sometimes it's called children's house. And then that went incredibly well. The parents were so pleased that they started asking, is there more? Like, could this happen in the elementary years as well? So the following year, we added a lower elementary classroom. And then the year after that, I had a meeting with our bishop during that academic year to talk about upcoming liturgies and whether he wanted to do ordinations from the chair or in front of the altar in the cathedral, like minor details of the sacred liturgy and programming. And in the middle of that meeting, like the Holy Spirit just spoke to me and said, tell him that you want to get trained to be a Montessori teacher. I thought, there's no way. I will say it out loud so he can tell me how stupid that is. And so I said, Your Excellency, I really think I want to get trained. And so he said, well, you should do it. Why don't you go and do the training? And I said, why don't I do it? Well, I've got, an ordination that I have to MC this summer. I've got a parish to take care of, And he said, take a sabbatical. I'll cover your Sunday masses for the summer while you're away, which he did. Our bishop covered
Wow.
Sunday mass. Yeah, it was incredible. So I went and got the training. Well, after I had made that decision, parents started saying, well, lower elementary is going so well. Why don't we add upper elementary? And so then the thought came, well, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should get into the classroom for a while. And so I thought, well, there's a good way to hear that this idea is stupid. I'm going to tell my friends I'm having this thought, and I'm also going to tell the bishop. And every last one of them said, oh, yeah, you should do it. It'll show everyone how serious this is and how much you really think this is important. And so I did. I went into the classroom for that. So I was the pastor of a fairly large parish and a classroom teacher in an upper elementary Montessori classroom and all these other responsibilities. And it was frankly too much. And so I approached the bishop in the middle of that year and I said, I can't keep doing all of this. And with graciousness, he said, if you could choose, he said, I can't tell you that you're going to get what you choose, but if you could choose, what would you choose? And I said, Your Excellency, I think there's too much at stake with education right now. And I think that Montessori education can play a real role in the church and beyond just what we're doing at our school at Christ the King in Mandan. And if I could choose, I think I would stay in the classroom and then try and help other people along the way as well. And so he granted that permission and scaled back my pastoral responsibilities. And now 8 years later, I'm still in an upper elementary classroom.
Awesome. It's such a fun story. There's this biblical resonance of like, you keep hearing crazy things and then you throw them out there and it's like, yeah, that's the thing. Like the crazy thing is the thing. So carry on, So in this work, you've had to learn a lot about Maria Montessori, of course. A lot of my audience, and myself included, will have like vague familiarity with Maria Montessori. So she's an Italian Catholic. She lived in the last century. She founded this method, which is now influential outside the bounds of the church. But there's this like vague sense that we know that her method is Catholic, but we don't know exactly how to articulate that and how that relates to the fact that it works in Catholic settings and non-Catholic settings and all this kind of stuff. Give us a little background on Maria Montessori, some of her own history, biography, and then let's move into thinking about her method and the theological underpinnings of that method.
That's a great question. So yeah, Dr. Montessori was born in the town of Chiaravalle. It's a little coastal town on the Adriatic coast of Italy in 1870. And really, you can see Assisi from Chiaravalle. So she was kind of born in the shadow of St. Francis. And if you read her writings, you see she quotes him fairly frequently. Her mother was a great lover of St. Francis, and a number of her earliest collaborators who helped her out even financially. It's interesting, Chiaravalle, it was founded by the the monks of Clairvaux. Chiaravalle is Clairvaux put into Italian. And it's interesting that the monks actually brought the tobacco trade to Italy. And her dad was the inspector for the tobacco trade. And you can imagine young Maria, they lived there until she was a little bit into her school year age, going out to the fields with her dad, And the monks did something that was revolutionary at the time. They employed women to go out and work the fields and to help with the trade. And so you can imagine, and they brought their children with them into the fields. And so you can imagine this young girl being, having this impression of the church is influential in shaping culture, that women have an important role to play in society, and that children should also be part of society and be there. These are like the earliest impressions that she had. Her parents wanted her to become a teacher, and she rejected that out of hand. I mean, she was a very, very bright young woman, and everyone knew it. She was, very precocious. And at first, she wanted to become a mechanical engineer. And she began the studies for that and quickly changed her mind and decided she wanted to become a medical doctor. And, she studied medicine. She was one of the first women to be granted a medical license in Italy. And her first assignment as a medical doctor was to work at the orthophrenic school in Rome, which we would probably call it a school for the handicapped. And the first thing she observed there was children who were sitting on the floor in these kind of sterile white rooms playing with their food. And the orderly who was giving her the tour was kind of mocking the children, look how stupid they are, sitting there playing with the food. And she was a very keen observer and a real genius. And she watched them for a little while and she said, no, the problem, they're not playing with their food because they're stupid. They're playing with their food because they've had no sensory stimulation. And she intuited that they needed an education, even though they had, limited abilities. So she went about studying special education at the time. And there were a number of French special educationists that she studied. And she brought their materials in, especially Séguin and Itard. And so she gave them an education in, language education, maths. And at the end of a couple of years of giving them an education, she said, I would like them to take the state exams. And they said, come on. I mean, the handicapped children, you want them to take okay, Maria, if you want them to do that. So she did, and they scored in the average range. And people were flabbergasted. How did these handicapped children score as well as normal children? And she said, you're asking the wrong question. What you should be asking is why the children in your schools that are clearly of superior intelligence are only doing as well as the handicapped children are. And a few years later, she was given a project. It was in 1907. Italy underwent the Industrial Revolution quite a bit later than the rest of Europe. And so Rome kind of had the growth of factories and factory workers. And there was a neighborhood, the San Lorenzo district, that was filled with tenements for the factory workers. So mom and dad were gone. The children were left, basically feral children. And they were destroying the tenement buildings. So a number of people knew some of the educational work that Maria Montessori had done. And she'd always wanted to apply some of the techniques that she'd learned with children of normal intelligence. So they said, Maria, could you come in? And they said, and do something with these children. And so she had a large open room, and I don't know, 50 or 60 children. And she started bringing in the materials that she had designed. And within a year, it was so successful that the city government of Milan asked her to come and train people to do the same thing. And within 3 years, people from all over the world were coming. So by 1910, she was holding training courses to train people from all over the world. And it's interesting because in the background, her faith was buoying up this entire mission. In that same year, 1910, Dr. Montessori professed private vows at a Franciscan convent along with a group of her friends. And she actually had a rule of life that she had written up, and it was sort of a private vow. And if you look at pictures of her late in life, she never married. She had a child out of wedlock, Mario, who kind of became the one who carried it on. But if you look at her, even later in her life, she's still wearing the wedding band that she would have received at her consecration day. So it's this golden thread that runs through her whole life. And throughout her life, she wrote extensively on religious education. A book on how to explain the maths for children, a book on living, children living their life in the church. And she proposed that there should be a special formation for people on how to form children in the faith, that they have a really active interior life if we just pay attention.
Let me just note one little thread that connects with a lot of the work we do here, which is the sense. So she's dealing with these kids with, severe limitations intellectually or otherwise. And she doesn't say, as far as I understand it, let's teach them math so that they can become accountants. She says, let's teach them math to fulfill something about the human person that is sort of crying out for fulfillment, rather than leave them in sterile rooms. And so much of the work I do involves helping teachers, but then helping teachers help parents to conceptualize education not as giving kids a certain set of skills or knowledge that they may or may not use in the job market, right? Because the vast majority of the things they're going to learn will not be applicable in the job market, right? But it's that you're entrusted with the formation of a person. And then the question, and it's interesting here because I haven't done a lot of this, but then the question of their innate ability is actually kind of irrelevant at that point. Because whatever their innate ability is and their particular gifting is, they're a human being created with a purpose, and they will be fulfilled by certain kinds of engagements and treatment and education, and not fulfilled by other kinds. And the goal is to fulfill a creature, a child of God, regardless of their whatever they might do when they grow up or whatever else. And so it's helpful for me to think about this like this applies to everybody. And it's a helpful base for thinking about special education and all kinds of other things, no matter who you've got in front of you, whether they're going to be a rocket scientist or they're going to live in a group home for the rest of their life. They will be more fulfilled by a certain engagement with the world, even starting with, as you mentioned, with sensory experience, embodied creatures that they are, rather than just thinking, well, what is their capacity to engage with whatever the economy is going to need from them as sort of cogs in the machine. Anyway, I just wanted to draw that connection out because we do that when we're talking about why should we read poetry in grade 11 or any other number of things that are useless. You know what I mean? So I just like that was really valuable for me to think that part through.
I love that. Well, I mean, and there's so much of that resonates. When Dr. Montessori, we were talking in the lead up about anthropology and like who the human person is. And if you read Dr. Montessori's writings, you'll notice that she's describing what we say the human person is in the great Catholic tradition. She talks about intellect and will, the formation of the senses, the formation of memory and imagination. And parts of that could read almost like a bit of St. Thomas pulled out. But then what she overlays on top of it is an understanding of human development and, how the human person is from the inside out forming those capacities through engagement in their environment. And it's remarkable. So just to, I don't want to go down any rabbit holes that you don't want to go down, but I just want to share one of these that I think can be really instructive. She talks about imagination. And if you look at St. Thomas, he says that there's two qualities that the human imagination has. One is a representative imagination. So we have experiences and we can call those experiences to mind. And they come from encountering reality, like real things in the world. And then he talks about the creative imagination, which is making distinctions, breaking down the impressions that we have and reassembling them into new objects in the imagination and that we can create through our own abilities. Well, Dr. Montessori says that up until the age of reason kicks in around age 6 or so, what we really ought to be doing is forming the representative imagination, because anything that gives the impression that a child in those years is using a creative imagination really is a mimicry of something that an adult is doing for them. So we want them to have real experiences with real things in the world that's building up the storehouse of impressions, so that when the creative imagination kicks in during the elementary years, that they have a storehouse that they can work with, and then they can really create and really like imagine things far beyond their experience.
Right. Well, okay, I'm going to go a little bit down the rabbit hole with you, and then we'll come up for air and go down a different one. But I love this because one of the questions in education more broadly is creativity. We need creative thinkers, and I think there's a fundamental mistake that is often made, which is that creativity is about like breaking rules. And so you look at someone like Picasso or something like that, who's profoundly creative, right? Dali, these things where you look at it and you say, this is clearly a creative person. I can tell just by looking, right? And then you find out that these people have done deep work in the tradition, even in the mechanics, right? The particular bodily, like they know how to make a brush stroke with a paintbrush, right? And you do the deep work of integration and encounter with reality, and only out of that is some creativity possible. Even if you think of, you watch someone play sports, and every once in a while you'll see some profoundly creative pass or deke in a shootout or whatever. And it is never done by someone who is not absolutely sound in the fundamentals, right? And so the picture you just gave for us of St. Thomas's understanding of imagination, I think gives us a really profound way of thinking that through. Like the creative imagination is important. We all agree. But how do you form it? You don't form it by running away from the fundamental, in this case, the representative, right? But you start there. And I think there's application for that in art, in sport, probably in like something that you don't even think of, like business, like profound creativity, or even the saints, like the profound moral creativity of the saints does not come from like being lackadaisical about virtue. Like in all of these cases, you put the building blocks in place and then creativity becomes possible. Whereas I think in our culture, we can conceive of creativity as like fundamentally rebellious. And then what you get actually is mimicry, right?
Absolutely. I have so many stories. This is a theme that like I have been thinking about for a long time. And I'll just share one of them. I don't know if you know who Jacques Pépin is. He's like one of these great classical French chefs. He was the personal chef for Charles de Gaulle, the World War II commander in France. Had an accident, came to America, and then became a television personality, and then brought French cuisine together with Julia Child. They kind of did some work together as well. Well, there's a video of him as an older gentleman completely deboning a whole chicken while he's watching the camera, not looking at his hands, taking the bones out so that he can turn it into a galantine, which is a stuffed, fully deboned whole chicken. And so he's like saying, now, young people today, he's like an 80-year-old man. Young people today always want to be creative and unique and different. And he said, I tell you how you do that. Master the basic techniques, and then the unique person that you already are will shine out. Like you're already unique. You don't have to do something special to be unique. What you have to do is master the things that every human being has to do in this art form, and then that uniqueness can reveal itself.
Oh, that's such a tight encapsulation, right? Because our young people want to be unique. And every high school teacher has observed that in trying to be unique, they repeat each other, right? And the idea that if you follow like God made you unique, you actually don't have to work for that. If you work for the fundamentals, if you develop your humanity, then your uniqueness shines through. That is such a freeing message actually for young people who have heard that they need to like be themselves, which of course is true, but is easily misunderstood as like assert something over against the world, or you know, in a way that you actually can't win, right? And so you're just going to keep digging yourself a hole, which leads to, you know, all kinds of things that we see in young people who are trying to be unique and be themselves. But we all have seen the young person who just is themselves and actually doesn't care about any of this, and we're like that. And teachers love. I don't know how many staff meetings I've been where a teacher will bring up, you know, Jimmy, and all the other teachers are like, I love Jimmy, and like Jimmy's the weirdo, like, and you know, like from his peers' point of view, he's a little odd. And the teachers love him because he's just himself, right? Anyway, okay, so up out of the rabbit hole a little bit, but let's go at the level of.
I don't want to. I don't.
Sure,
Wanna,
yes.
But I just want to point something out here, that you said that young people spend so much time on doing something that they already are, instead of working on the thing that will allow that to happen. I mean, that's diabolical. Like, if you think about the first temptation, if you consume this fruit, you will become like God. The truth is, they already are. They put the work in to the thing to do something that they already were, rather than putting the work into like avoiding that one thing so that they could live that out in their life. I mean, it's like straight back to the original temptation.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah. That's a nice bow to put on it. Yeah. Yeah. And a really helpful interpretive lens for that story, which sometimes we get confused because what the devil says is not exactly a lie. Like, it's a half truth, which is the more dangerous thing, right? So okay, we could do this for a long time. The imagination is one example of a more general pattern, which is something like Maria Montessori, and through her, the Catholic tradition, including like Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, have this vision of the human person, which includes like really thoughtful engagements with like our inner dynamics of things like will and imagination, intellect, all that kind of stuff, right? And then when that method gets put into real practical use, it has these incredible results, so much so that it spreads far beyond the church, and it becomes incredibly practical and useful and valued outside the bounds of the church. And so you have this really interesting dynamic where the Catholic vision of the human person informs a sort of practical method which shows its value. And then, I don't know if smuggled is exactly the right word, because that implies a kind of intention that's maybe a little too strong, but the Catholic vision of the human person gets smuggled into these secular contexts where, in at least some cases, the goal is like high achievement in like secular pursuits and job markets and whatever else. And it works, which is this weird, and I call this like the seek ye first principle. Like, if you actually care for the formation of the student, the job market stuff and the skills and the college and career preparedness and whatever else, that's going to follow. But anyways, then in many cases, Montessori has this like vaguely Catholic sense that a lot of us can't articulate, and people who are maybe non-Catholics who are just happy to see their kids flourishing are like, yeah, well, we can leave the Catholic bit behind. And as far as they know, they are leaving it behind because they're not, you know, talking about mass or saints or anything else like that. But there's a vision of the incarnate human person, like the embodiment. I think that's probably an interesting theme, right? Sensory experience, embodiment, the relationship between senses and knowledge and intellect. But then also things like you said about imagination. We could also talk about the will. A Catholic vision of the will seems to be at play here. So take your pick. Like, let's go down any rabbit hole you want there, whether it's incarnation or will or some combination of them. What's the vision of the human person? And then maybe more specifically of the child, as you mentioned, the human development element of it, the overlay, that is informing the practical method.
There is so much there. So in 1946, Dr. Montessori gave a training course in London, and the lectures from that course are published. And she gave during that training session an individual lecture just on the intellect and the formation of the intellect, a whole lecture just on the formation of the will and what it means for the will to be formed. And one of the interesting things, just if we want to stay with the will for a while, one of the hallmarks that I think when people think of Montessori education is freedom. And when she talks about freedom, she says this is necessary for the formation of the will, because the will is formed through choice. And if there isn't an opportunity for choice, then the will never gets formed, because you're always doing someone else's will, which also is important. Obedience is something that we have to learn as human beings as well. But for her, freedom is not something that is external to the child, like I'll give you freedom or I'll not give you freedom. Freedom is an interior quality of the capacity to make good choices. And so for her idea of the development of freedom of the will, for the very young child, it's freedom within limits. And so that's the first thing, is you limit the choice to, two things that you can choose, and you can't make a bad choice between those two things, but you can choose to sit at this table, or you can choose to sit at this table. You can choose to work on this or on this, and you really limit it. And then as that sphere of influence of the will extends, she talks about freedom and discipline. And what she's talking about is interior discipline. That freedom allows a person to make disciplined choices, that they're not living in chaos, that this interior quality grows. And then the last sphere of influence of freedom that then can move beyond the self and into society is freedom with responsibility. Like, I am capable of exercising free choice for the sake of this community, in accord with the needs that the community and I have. And that typically for her, she sees, the first 2 to 3 years of life being freedom with limits, 3 to 6 year olds kind of having freedom and discipline developing, and then the elementary child developing that capacity for freedom with responsibility.
Right. We actually talk about this quite a bit in different disciplines as you move into high school. The paradoxical relationship between rules or structure on the one hand and freedom on the other. Something like how our culture misconceives how creativity works. We misconceive how freedom works because we think it's the absence of rules. But the Decalogue, like explicitly in the Old Testament, God is like, you're free from the external oppressor. I'm going to give you these rules so that you stay free. Right? And the Jewish understanding of the gift of the 10 Commandments, right? That the rules are a gift from God to keep us free. And so then we encounter this. One encounter is in grammar, right? If you follow the rules of grammar, you're free to express yourself. If you don't follow the rules of grammar, you're not free. And I often appeal to the human experience of freedom. So we might conceptualize freedom as over and against rules. And this is a silly example, but it hits home because everyone has done this. You go into the grocery store and you go to pick up your shampoo, and your shampoo is sold out. There are 100 options for shampoo. Do you feel free in that moment? And everyone's like, no, I don't feel free, right? And now for married people especially, you go to pick up your spouse's shampoo and it's not there, right? And you got to come home with some shampoo. Now, if your spouse gave you a set of criteria, if they said, if my shampoo's not there, just make sure you get something with no scent. Okay, now I'm free. Make sure if mine's not there, just get the cheapest one. Okay, now I'm free. If mine's not there, get this other one that is pretty similar to it. Well, now I'm free. But if it's just get mine and it's not there, I have 100 choices and I'm not free, right? And so anyway, it shows up in so many different sports, music, all kinds of places where structure is actually, or rules are the structure of freedom, not the enemy of freedom. And in fact, when rules are the enemy of freedom, genuine freedom, that's how you can tell they're bad rules. Like that's a criteria by which, right? If the rules here take away from a person's legitimate freedom, and make them more dependent or less and I don't mean, I mean dependent in a negative sense, because I know there's a good kind of dependence too, right? Which is why what you said about obedience is not the opposite of forming their freedom or their will, but it's actually like obedience in its proper context is an act of the will and an act of the free will rather than an imposition on that free will, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm choosing to do the will of another person. I'm listening, obedience means to listen, so it's like I'm listening to this person and choosing to do their will instead of mine.
Right. And yeah. So, okay, so will is a great one. You mentioned she did another one on intellect.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because this could be a good segue to looking at how human development influences our understanding of education. One of the interesting things that Dr. Montessori said was all of my work was psychological, but all of my results were pedagogical. So by studying the psychology of the child and the developmental psychology of the child, she then learned how to respond to the emerging needs that children have at different stages. And so she said that the characteristics of the mind of the child up until about age 6, when we classically say is the age of reason, she called it the absorbent mind. And so she wrote an entire book on it, which is her study of this characteristic of the very young child. And she uses this really clever image. Photography was new during her lifetime. And she said that the absorbent mind takes in the environment in the same way that a photograph does, all at once, everything without a filter. Whereas the reasoning mind, which comes later, is the way an artist through brush strokes recreates their environment bit by bit, piece by piece. And so she says this is the reason why the environment has to be so carefully prepared for the youngest child and why all of the things that are necessary for their development is there. And then along with the absorbent mind, she says that the young children goes through what she calls sensitive periods. And a sensitive period is a moment in life when all of the psychological energy of the child is completely focused on one object. And so there's a sensitive period for the development of movement. So a young child, by observing the movement of others, is working on creating movement within their own body. And if the environment has opportunities for them to exercise that movement well, they'll develop movement that's smooth and, coordinated, and, both gross motor and fine motor skills will develop. There's another sensitive period, for instance, for the development of language. And within that, there's even smaller sensitive periods that have, there's been research that's confirmed all of her observation since then. But there's a period from about 8 to 11 months when a child is developing all the phonemes of a language that they're learning, that is in their environment. And their brain is essentially working like a statistical analysis. And so they're analyzing the sounds that they're hearing other human beings in their environment making. And then at the end of that period, a child is babbling. And they're babbling using only the sounds that they have heard in their environment. So a baby in Mexico is babbling using Spanish syllables, whereas a baby in North Dakota is, using weird O's. And it's part of their development. And each one of these, it's interesting that she says that if the environment is prepared well and a child has what they need during the sensitive period, they easily acquire those skills because their entire psychic energy is directed towards that. If they don't have what's needed during that sensitive period, they can acquire that skill later, but with great effort, and it's not as organic and natural. And you can hear and see the effort that's in them because they didn't acquire it in a way that was natural to them.
Let me do some etymology, right? Because when we hear sensitive, we often think in sort of emotional terms, right? But I think what you're saying and what Dr. Montessori is saying is like, this is dependent on your senses, right? You are encountering reality, like the phonemes example, your sense of hearing. Like, this is super essential at this time that you can hear or with the movement patterns, it might be what we might call today in like physiotherapy circles, like proprioception or something like that, which is often like we list the 5 standard senses, but like often if you throw in a 6th one, it's like the sense of your body in space, which is like proprioception. So like sensitive in this case is like a technical term. Like your senses are primed to encounter reality, take in data that your brain then is processing in a certain way, right? And so I wonder if speak a little to the incarnational sense, right? The human person. Thomas Aquinas's epistemology starts with the senses. This even is at the root of his doctrine of the sacraments, right? God gives us sacraments because our knowledge is mediated through the material, right? And that's the kind of creature that we are.
Absolutely. If you go to a primary classroom in a Montessori school, a classroom for 3 to 6-year-olds, there's an entire portion of that room that's dedicated to the formation of the senses and the discrimination of the senses. So, there's a material called the I don't work with primary, so the names are escaping me, but it's a series of boards that will go from rough to smooth. And so they sense the difference between rough and smooth. Dr. Montessori calls proprioception, she has her own terminology for it. She calls it the stereognostic sense.
Okay.
And so she actually has, they're called stereognostic bags, and they have objects inside these bags, and the child puts them inside the bag and feels it to create the image in their mind of what the object is, and then, names the object based on that. And it's fascinating because if you think of that, what she's recognizing is that the hand is a tool of the intellect, but also an instrument for receiving for the intellect. And this intimate connection between the hand and the mind is really, really a core piece of her philosophy. And one last piece that I'll mention, it's a story that someone told me a while ago. And there was a worker who was cutting boards for a window in a Montessori primary classroom. He was going outside, cutting them and bringing them in and doing repairs on the windows. And it was a 5 or 6-year-old child, and the gentleman brought the board that he had cut in, to do the repair. And the child asked the gentleman, what's the board for? And he said, well, I'm fixing the window. And the child said, it's too small. You cut it too short. And the fellow said, no, I didn't. I measured it. And the child said, fine. The fellow went over, put it to the window, and sure enough, he had cut it too short. The children's senses were so carefully formed through the materials that they could recognize that at sight.
Right. Well, okay, here's a rabbit hole. Let's just go a little ways into it. But this is probably almost too on the nose, but I was like, how many iPads are there in that corner of the room?
0.
Right. And I just talked to a teacher. I had never thought about it this way before, but she's like grade 2, 3 teacher who said kids can't tie their shoes anymore. And she put it on screens. She said that they don't live in a 3-dimensional world, and tying your shoes is a very 3-dimensional action. And she said they don't have learning to write and tying your shoes are 2 very common places where manual dexterity at that age, probably you're in a sensitive period, and you're missing the sensitive period for learning to write or tying your shoes, or probably there's other similar kinds of activities, because you're living in a 2-dimensional world, and the image of the human person that follows from that, which gets into our relationship with artificial intelligence and all this other kind of stuff, is that the human person is an intelligence that happens to be embodied, but that's really inconvenient. Wouldn't it be better if all the intelligence could be disembodied into something like code? Maybe we could even live forever in code, actually, without these pesky bodies. I mean, it's an ancient heresy, actually, but it's this new form, which we could go into, like the importance of phys ed at this point. Like, there's a lot of places where you could go with this basic insight, but we are fundamentally sort of disembodying our children and ourselves, and what that means for, I mean, even something like, if I may be like slightly risque, but like our capacity for physical intimacy as we get older, like all this kind of stuff follows, I think, and we're seeing it in the data and in our own experiences of relationships. We're seeing what happens when we disembody ourselves through our engagement with screens. Like when you said rough or smooth, and I was like, that screen has one consistency. You know what I mean? Anyway, thoughts on that? Because that, I was like, okay, we could do a whole other episode on that. But
Oh yeah, that whole thing is it diminishes the capacity for the development of the senses. Surely, two-dimensional world, no, all you've really got is color and light. But man, does it go deep. I mentioned this study on the development of phonemes for 8 to 10, 11-month-olds. Well, a corollary to that was they thought, well, what happens if we have children have experience with someone who speaks a different language than theirs? So they started doing the same study, but bringing in once a week for about an hour someone who was fluent in another foreign language. They also began to incorporate those sounds only when that person was present. And they thought, okay, this is interesting. What then happens if we do it through a video recording of a person? And so they played videos. Nothing. They picked up none of it, which shows that education from the very earliest is a human to human reality. It can't be mediated through a screen.
Right. Well, so I run our diaconate formation program here, and we have weekends, Friday evening through Sunday after lunch, right? And when COVID hit, the first weekend where we couldn't gather in person, we just recreated. We got all the presenters who were lined up to just do online presentations, and we followed the same schedule that we were following when we had in-person meetings. And by the end of the weekend, everyone wanted to like jump off a building. Like we were so exhausted. Now, normally at a formation weekend, you're tired at the end, but it's a kind of good tired, like you've done real work. Here it was like a gouge your eyes out kind of tired, and no one wanted to do it again. So we rescheduled everything to do weekly meetings on Tuesday evenings with shorter content delivery, because you just can't deliver content over a screen in that kind of condensed period. And then a little ways into that, I went to my committee and I said, look, I can convey information over a video conference, right? And we're doing it right now. It's possible to do it, right? But I don't know my guys. And so I asked the committee for an extension. So we turned our 4-year program into a 5-year program so that when we got back together, so we could we had some great presenters online, like really solid information. But I had no idea where the guys were and how they were integrating and the relationships and all the stuff that happens at breaks and over meals and praying together and all that stuff, which is so essential to formation, was just missing. And it was reduced to information transfer. And information transfer is essential. We need that in a formation program for diaconate or anything else. But it wasn't formation. And so, and the committee granted me, they said, take another year with these guys. And so anyways, it's very interesting that the anecdote you shared about the TV screens, I had an analog in my own experience of formation, right?
It's fantastic.
So you've started leading us already in your response about the intellect to the practical question of what this looks like on the ground, right? And so for those who haven't seen it, and you've already given little descriptions here and there, but let's go into like a little more detail. For those who haven't seen it, what is the atmosphere like in a Montessori classroom? How does this, you had a great line, like her research is psychological, but the results are pedagogical. Let's talk about those pedagogical results.
Yeah, if you look at a primary classroom, 3 to 6-year-olds, it's usually shocking to observers how quiet it is. the children in a Montessori primary classroom do a lot of individual work. And what you notice when you enter a classroom like that is you first look, where is the adult? Because the adult is usually sitting on the floor, maybe giving a presentation to a child, or sitting next to them, helping them out with a presentation. And the children, each of them are individually going about their work. And that work might be doing math using a set of golden beads that represent thousands, hundreds, tens, and units in shapes that represent their values. So units are individual beads, and tens are bars, and hundreds are squares, and thousands are cubes. And or they may be working with a sensorial material like a pink tower. It's a pretty iconic Montessori material. It's 10 cubes. The smallest one is a cubic centimeter, and the largest one is 10 by 10 by 10. So it's introducing the decimal system, discrimination of value, of shape, and also introducing the metric system, because they're a centimeter by a centimeter to 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So it's all kind of written to the material. Maybe you'll see a child doing some work with something in their practical life. There are frames. You talked about tying shoes. There's a frame for learning how to tie a knot, or teaching the hands how to button a button, which is a preparation for them then to be able to put on their own clothes, so that they don't need an adult's assistance. All of this work is meant to be an aid for life. So it has real outcome. Maybe you'll see a couple of children who are preparing snack for themselves, and cutting their banana into slices and putting it together and sitting it down, or doing their dishes afterward. But there'll be a really almost monastic feel to that classroom. Then if you go to an elementary classroom, so 6 to 9-year-olds, 9 to 12-year-olds, or even a 6 to 12-year-old classroom, sometimes all of those grades would be together. So that would be first through third grade, third through sixth grade, or first through sixth grade traditionally. There's going to be a real buzz of activity, and there's going to be a lot of conversation going on. You'll see a lot of children in small groups, sitting together at tables or on the floor, usually working on projects together. We call it a language-rich environment, because the children really are doing a lot of talking. You'll see the adult maybe sitting with a group of 3 or 4 children, and maybe giving a presentation on how to do square roots using a material, or maybe giving a presentation on Aztec civilizations and some keys to that, or maybe presenting a timeline of the history of life on Earth. And so the classrooms look a little bit different depending on the age and the kind of activity that's happening. But what you'll ultimately see is children really engaged in their own formation, using the tools that have been given to them by the adult.
One of the ideas in my head is, it is in our secular ideological terms, it's very tough to pigeonhole this. A lot of people would imagine it's conservative, and in some sense it is. And then there's something like very progressive, and in a certain sense it is, right? And I think our modern ideology grows out of a fractured anthropology, and chooses one true thing about the human person to the exclusion of something else, and then runs in, to the right or to the left. And there's something really integrated, right? Like the idea that you would have just kids just talking seems like super progressive, maybe. Except that I've seen this done in more progressive, more universally progressive contexts. And instead of ordered, it becomes a little chaotic. And then the teacher has to scramble to put the lid on things. But they're ideologically committed to letting the kids have their way. And then there's this weird boomerang between authoritarianism and freedom, because it doesn't conceptualize either authority or freedom very well. Okay, I'm back into the theoretical. I apologize. But anyways, it just seems to me that one of the appeals of Montessori, and one of the reasons it appeals to conservatives and progressives, well, first of all, they just see the results in their kids. But second, the true thing that they actually have right about the human person, whether you're conservative or progressive, shows up there, but it does what it's supposed to do, because it's not isolated from the broader vision of the human person the way it is in so much of our contemporary secular ideologies. Okay, I didn't mean to go down that.
That's great stuff. I often think that when something in the church is at its best, you can't pigeonhole it as conservative or progressive. because the church is beyond those categories. I mean, we certainly are traditional in a certain sense because we're connected to tradition, so it has some of that element, but it's that tradition showing up now in this moment, and so it has that quality to it too. So I think the best things in the church are always beyond. And I wouldn't say, neither conservative nor progressive, but beyond those categories in some way.
Right. What's the line? The kingdom of God is like the what is it? The storekeeper. He goes into his storehouse and brings out the old and the new.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Right. So you were starting to move towards the older kids, and that's a question I have, because for a lot of us, Montessori is like for the littles. And obviously her work was, focused in a lot of ways on that, and the thing about the sensitive periods and all that sort of thing. But there is also this sense that like the human person is the human person is the human person. And so I'm wondering about like broad application. If you have a vision of the human person with this sense of the will and the intellect and the imagination and the embodiment and all those things, it takes on a certain shape as you get into the middle years. But even I'm thinking like outside of school or high school, or like I'm thinking like attitudes towards something like phys ed becomes an obvious kind of connection here. But then I'm even thinking of like parenting, or really curious from your point of view and experience, like pastoral work, because you're in every case you're dealing with the human person. And if you don't have a good image of what the human person is, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And so I'm wondering about broad applicability, what you've learned from the Montessori method. Where else does it show up in life?
Wow. Well, there's so many places I could go with that question. This is how about let's start here. Dr. Montessori has this idea that human beings very often early in their life pick up deviations. And those deviations are, she says that they're a place where the soul and the body are not integrated. And they often happen through environment. I mean, we could maybe use some more contemporary language, like mini traumas can cause these kinds of things. And she says that what actually heals them is purposeful work, especially in those early years of 3 to 6 year olds. And so she says that these deviations are either fugues, like we want to run away from something, or they're barriers. And it's interesting, she even says that sometimes things that appear to be intellectual difficulties are actually a deviation of a barrier that's put up. And that if the deviation can be healed, she even uses the language of healing. And she says that when the child is normalized, meaning return to the norm of what a child should be without these deviations, they kind of go away. And this individual who is capable of obedience, who has order in their life, who is communicative and socially oriented and all these kinds of things, reveals itself. And so I often think, even in the context of confession or spiritual counseling, people will bring things up and the work has put me in a place where I'm like, oh man, that is from your earliest years of life. Let's see if we can find a way to bring Christ into that place, because at a certain point in life, it's Christ who has to be the healer. There are certain moments in life when we might be able to have some healing come about through our own activity. And then there comes a point where it's like, well, I can't do this I can't fix it myself in my soul anymore. And I need to bring the divine healer into that and let him work. And he certainly can. And so, boy, it pops up all over the place, that this idea of what happens early in life then plays out later in life.
Right. I'm reminded of some work I've read recently about how certain forms or certain attitudes towards like psychotherapy can actually be counterproductive. And one of the things that I hope we're learning, particularly about young people, is a kind of an approach that encourages rumination on negative feelings is really counterproductive, and in fact can spread through a peer group right? And so everyone, like young people today, have been trained to talk about their mental health all the time. And of course, there's a good impetus that we don't want to bury B-U-R-Y, right? We don't, mental health issues so that like there's a stigma attached and we can't talk about it. So like that's a good thing. But one of the things that can happen when that's not done well is a kind of consistent rumination on negative feelings. And I won't have the words exactly right, but you said Dr. Montessori talked about like the way to work through these, well, the solution to these deviations is some kind of disciplined work, which strikes me as like a much healthier approach than like rumination on past grievance or feelings or whatever else the thing is, right? And I just think like most of us have had the experience where like work is the way out, right? Like sit on my couch and feel bad, or like force myself into the sunlight and fresh air and go for a walk. And like sometimes it's that simple. But I think we, in our well-intentioned, attempts to remove stigma around conversations around mental health, and like I'm not against that. I'm just saying, be aware that doing it poorly can have certain consequences, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about Dr. Jordan Peterson's advice to young men: go make your bed.
Right. Which resonated in a way that, I mean, it almost gets made fun of. It's become so commonplace, and it shouldn't be used to paper over like real difficulties. But there is a truth in it too, right? That like rumination is not like get up and move and do something and take some responsibility. Actually, and like to go back to the question of freedom, right? The Montessori method is forming responsible people from the time they're very young. We don't take people without responsibility for 18 years and then say, now you're grown up, all the restraints are off, make your own decisions, best of luck with that. When we haven't given them any formation in interior freedom and responsibility before that, right?
That's right. Yeah. All these choices add up into the ability to make good choices, really, ultimately.
Right. And as a parent, we've seen like giving kids we're perceived a little strangely. So we homeschooled for a while. We're still homeschooling the younger kids. The older kids went to high school. And so our two boys went to high school, and they had been homeschooled, and they're from a family of 7 and they're homeschooled and, all this other kind of stuff. Right. And then they had like remarkable liberties relative to some of their peers. And their peers were kind of shocked at our sort of lackadaisical attitudes towards things like, and I don't want to give the wrong impression of my kids because they don't do a lot of this, but like we're not really worked up about things like drinking and fighting and girlfriends and like whatever. Our kids have not done anything really stupid in those regards, but we're just way more chill. That's what our kids would say. Like our peers are shocked by how chill you are. And we're kind of like, well, we formed you as free, responsible people. We don't think like mistakes here are inconsequential. We don't want to be like foolhardy, but also like at a certain point, you're the one in charge of your decisions. And so at what point do we hand that over? Now, on the other hand, we're very, I don't know if rigid is the term. We're very intentional about screens. So our kids you get a phone when you get a license, and that phone doesn't have social media, and the browser's capacity is extremely limited and monitored. And so it's a camera and a phone and a text machine, and you can use it to look at maps and whatever. But so we have some certain things where we're very clear and intentional, but in a lot of ways we're like really relaxed in a way that surprises people. But it grows out of our sense of like, we're forming free and responsible people. I'm not gonna like keep all the barriers super tight and authoritative, and then when you're 18 or 19 or whenever I just can't control you anymore, hope for the best.
Yeah, that sounds really lovely. Yeah, and there are certain places where you have to be like absolute. Like you can't do anything that's going to break your head.
Right. Yeah.
Like But if you're gonna, do something where you might put yourself in danger of breaking an arm, well, that might be okay to be able to learn how to take some risks.
Right. We did tree climbing when the kids were little, and we made all the neighbors nervous because our rule for tree climbing is, do you feel safe? And if a kid feels safe up a tree, they are almost certainly safe. Kids who break their arms riding bikes or falling off trees or whatever, well, trees in particular, almost all the data says if a kid broke his arm climbing a tree, it's because there was some peer pressure and he was doing something that he wasn't comfortable doing. If a child is comfortable in a tree, he's almost certainly safe. And you know it yourself, because if you've been up a tree, you know when you're safe and you know when you're not. And kids actually know that. And if they haven't been given the opportunity to learn that, the odds of them breaking an arm doing something completely benign and banal goes way up, right? So anyway, like all of these, like that's a very Montessori thing, right? This is proprioception. This is like knowing and trusting your own senses and sense of your body up a tree. And we just had this sense early on that like kids needed to learn to trust their own instincts up a tree, and that is transferable to like things like trusting your own instincts when strangers are talking in a way that is uncomfortable or whatever it is. Like you have to learn how to trust your own engagement with reality in that moment. And if you're always looking over your shoulder for mom or dad, that runs out real quick, Father, last words. We're at just over the hour. My audience can tell I get too excited. But I'm gonna own it because I had students who once told me, no, that's good. We like it when you get excited. So I've been taught to be embarrassed about it, but no, that's good. It's good that you got me so excited. Last words that you would say to anyone who wants to like learn more. Maybe they're looking at their elementary school, or maybe they want to start. We haven't even talked about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, but like Montessori can be in school, but it can also be a catechetical program that happens at the parish. If someone wants to learn more about this or is interested in starting it in their own community, what would you tell them? Where would they go for resources? All that kind of stuff.
I would start. There's two things I would say. The first thing I would start is to say, find a Montessori school and go observe, because we can tell the lovely stories and explain the theory and the method and all those kinds of things all day long, but you don't really understand it till you see the children at work. And it happens so often that we have guests at our school who say things like, I heard about this, but I can't actually believe that it's real. And now
you need your own sensory experience.
Exactly. Yeah. So find a good Montessori school and schedule an hour or 2 hours or a day of observing in classrooms. That's a really, really important thing. And then if a person wants to learn more about the method, actually the University of Mary in Bismarck recently started a Catholic Montessori Institute, which provides resources and an annual conference and networking and all kinds of things. And to reach out there, a person could get plugged in with people who could guide them to further resources as well. It is an interesting thing that the Montessori world, she never wanted her name trademarked. So you can find a lot of things in the world that say Montessori that might not completely reflect her work or reflect the method or be authentic. And so, plugging into people who are a little bit more savvy and a little bit more connected to the Montessori world, I think would be really helpful.
Right. And my listeners are going to be Catholics who want to do it in a Catholic way. And so the fact that a Catholic university like the University of Mary is taking on some leadership here, I think is going to be really helpful. And I'll take the opportunity to just mention, I'm working with the University of Mary now. So starting in June, if you're listening to this when it comes out, this is going to be like spring 2026. So June 2026, I'm going to be on campus at the University of Mary, working with the Faculty of Education there on a certificate in Catholic integration leadership. Hopefully, this will also happen in subsequent years. So if you're listening to this down the road, this is probably still available. So whether you want to look at Montessori stuff or whether you would like more formation in leading Catholic integration in your school or diocese, the University of Mary is a place where both of those things are happening. And as we've, I think, seen from this conversation, there's a real synergy between the approach that I'm taking with making every class Catholic and Montessori, because they're both really rooted in this Catholic vision of the human person. You know, I didn't realize it until after I wrote the book, but my sort of theological lodestar in the book was really the anthropology of Thomas Aquinas and the doctrine of creation. And so even though I'm tackling the question from quite a different angle, there ends up being remarkable sort of overlap between, like, how do you form a young child for life, and like, how do you think about poetry or volleyball from a Catholic point of view, which is kind of the frame I come at it. There ends up being all this kind of overlap, right?
Great stuff. Wonderful.
Father Nick, it was a delight to have you on the show. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I know my audience is really going to appreciate this. So just allow me to finish with a word of gratitude and blessings on your road.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with you, Brett. God bless you.